A U.S. official had told Bloomberg that there were no concessions made in terms of Turkey coming on board, allowing Sweden and Finland to join. But do you think that now this means the U.S. is willing or more willing to potentially give in to Turkey's long-standing request for updated F-16s?
Look, we've been in full support of Turkey's desire to modernize their F-16 fleet, and that hasn't changed. There's no policy change there at all. This was a discussion that needed to be and was between Turkey, Finland, Sweden, and of course Secretary Stoltenberg at NATO, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't insert ourselves as broker, if you will. And so we welcome this agreement. It's going to be terrific for the alliance. These are two modern militaries that are very interoperable with the rest of NATO, and they are going to contribute terrific capabilities in terms of collective defense.
But Turkey's not getting anything from Washington for this.
It wasn't never about getting something from Washington. It's about...
but they might assume that something could be down the pipeline.
Turkey is a key ally and a good partner on a range of issues. The president will be speaking with Mr. Erdogan today. They'll have a wide-ranging discussion across the realm of our defense partnership, not just their modernization programs with their air fleet, but counterterrorism efforts, certainly efforts to try to get the grain out of Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot on the plate.
About the grain out of Ukraine, is that possible by sea right now?
Not right now, it isn't, because the Russians have an effective, essential blockade inside the Black Sea.
But any plans to extract it?
We are working very, very hard with partners all around the world to try to see what we can do to get more grain out of Ukraine. We have helped increase the flow by ground, by rail, out of western Ukraine, but that's not enough. We know that, and we know there's a sense of urgency here. So one of the items on the agenda at the G7, and I'm sure will be on the agenda here in Madrid, is to see what can the international community do to get more of that grain out. Now, Turkey's been trying to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot more work to be done there. But we certainly welcome Turkey's efforts to get at that.
You were at the G7, and President Zelensky had called and hoped for the war to be over by the end of the year. Do you think that's doable?
We would all like to see the war end today, and it could end today if Mr. Putin would do the right thing.
But that's not realistic.
Well, Mr. Putin has shown no indication that he's willing to negotiate. He shows every indication that he wants to continue to attack Ukraine and to achieve military objectives. So what we're going to do with the rest of much of the international community is help Ukraine better defend itself.
What about the U.S. anti-missile defense systems? The president was able to positively, as Jake Sullivan said, respond to President Zelensky about more of this, but we don't know the answers yet of how many, what time will they be delivered, how are you going to train the Ukrainians?
We are working really hard to get them some advanced air defense capabilities. I would remind you that we had already been working hard to help with their air defense capabilities, both in terms of the delivery of thousands of Stinger missiles, as well as brokering a deal with, helping broker a deal with Slovakia to get an S-300 system put over into Ukraine. So this is not a new request. This is something we've been working with them for a long time. We'll have more details as we get a little closer, but the system the president's talking about is a U.S. and Norwegian built advanced air defense system, and again, we'll have more to say about that as we get closer.
We also have today the president talking about a new headquarters in Poland, more brigades in Romania, really bolstering the eastern flank. Do you think Putin will view this as a provocation by NATO?
There's no reason that Mr. Putin needs to view any force posture changes on NATO's eastern flank as a provocation. NATO is, will be, always has been a defensive alliance. The reason we have to do this is because Mr. Putin has been the destabilizing influence on the continent. Mr. Putin decided to invade a sovereign neighboring state. Mr. Putin is the one who is the aggressor.
I also, just on that point though, there are some insinuations from the likes of Germany and Spain, France, that maybe you have to start talking about negotiations and a real ceasefire and what Ukraine would maybe have to give up. Does the U.S. think that any of that should be on the table?
It's up to Mr. Zelensky to determine how this war will end and on what terms. He has said himself that he does not see that there's time and space for negotiations at this time. And of course, Mr. Putin has shown no inclination to do that. We all want to see this war end. It could end, as I said, tomorrow if Mr. Putin would do the right thing. Short of that, it's going to be up to President Zelensky to determine when and where and under what circumstances negotiations could even begin.
Here at NATO, you also called all the partners China a systemic challenge in this new strategic concept that outlines the next decade. Why not an adversary?
I think there's a whole range of issues with respect to multilateral and even bilateral relationships with China. We have long said, for our sake in the United States, that we want it to be competition. We don't want it to fall into conflict, and there's no reason that it should. That said, I think what you're seeing in this strategic concept that the alliance will sign out in this summit, the first one since 2010, is that the alliance...
2010 China wasn't even mentioned.
It wasn't even mentioned. It's a recognition by the allies that China does pose security and economic challenges that weren't in the game 10 years ago, whether it's unfair trade practices and use of forced labor, intellectual theft, coercion and intimidation of neighboring nations, not just in Europe, but in Africa and the Middle East. So it's a reflection of the concern that all allies have.
But you were in the Navy, you're an admiral in the Navy, and right now what we've reported at Bloomberg is that Chinese military has used the terms that the Taiwan Strait is not international waters.
The international law recognizes that the strait is international waters, and that is why the United States, as well as other nations, continue to sail and fly inside those international boundaries.
How concerning is that language is changing?
It's deeply concerning what the Chinese are doing in the region in terms of trying to expand bogus and illegal claims to territory, airspace, and sea space. Also, what they're doing to try to coerce and intimidate their neighbors and other countries in the region to exacerbate tensions and to further these claims. But again, we, for our part, we're going to sail, we're going to fly, we're going to operate where international law permits.
What about a phone call with President Xi and President Biden? When can we expect that?
I don't have any conversation to speak to.
But soon,
today.
Before the fall?
And the president will be willing to talk to foreign leaders, no matter who they are. If it's in our best national security interest, I think I'll leave it at that.
Speaking of a foreign leader, he's making an inaugural trip to Saudi Arabia. He will be meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. We've reported that for any sort of oil to be released, more oil from Saudi Arabia, there needs to be some security guarantees. What could those be? What could the U.S. insinuate when you're in Riyadh about security guarantees for the Gulf?
Well, just to be clear, we're going to the region to meet bilaterally, of course, with our Israeli counterparts as well as Palestinian leaders, and we're going on to Saudi Arabia as part of the GCC. Saudis are the hosts, and so we're going as a part of the GCC. Now, clearly, there'll be bilateral discussions with the Saudis, and I suspect that those discussions inside and outside the GCC will cover a range of topics. Energy will certainly be on the agenda, but I don't think I want to get ahead of where we're going to be.